So what exactly is Angular 2? Angular 2 is an HTML, CSS, JavaScript-based application framework. Now, Angular 2, when you do most of your Angular 2 coding, you are in fact mostly writing JavaScript. But because of the nature of components and because of Angular 2's templating system, there is a fair amount of HTML and CSS coding that you'll be doing as part of using Angular 2. Now, it is cross-platform. What do we mean by that? Of course, you can use it to create web applications, but if you combine it with something like Electron, you can use it to create desktop applications. Also, you're going to be able to create native applications with it using something called NativeScript. So when you're learning Angular 2 and all of the versions that will follow after it, you're not just learning something that you can do like for a simple web application in a web browser. You're learning something that you can actually use to build all of your UIs in the future, no matter what platform you're on. Another advantage to Angular 2 is speed and performance. You can do, ultimately at the end of the day, no matter what framework or library that you're using to build your web applications, all of the same DOM operations and functions and stuff like that that those UI libraries do for you, you can actually do yourself. However, when you use things like in Angular 2, ultimately it results in code that knows how to more intelligently, more efficiently make updates to the DOM, make changes to things. And so you'll have better performing applications. Also, it provides a nice framework structure so that you can build things that are going to be reusable. Productivity. It provides a whole bunch of different tools for making life a little bit easier for getting up and running. For example, you can do template-based development. A lot of developers are very familiar with working with HTML and thinking about building their UIs with HTML. So because of Angular 2's template-based approach, it makes it a little bit easier to get up and running with that. There's an Angular CLI, which provides a bunch of tooling for making it easier to get up and running with projects, to add additional things to your projects, that kind of stuff. We also have what we call the full development story. All right. Basically, Angular 2 is more than just a way to put a UI widget on a screen. It's got full support for testing, animations, accessibility, all types of things like that. It's really the complete solution to your UI development problems. All right. Now, Angular 2 is going to provide us a number of different components, or not components, but parts. We'll call it parts because there's something called a component. Parts that allow us to manage our application. For example, Angular 2 has something called modules. Modules allow us to take different parts and put them together and then be able to redistribute those modules for reuse in other applications. It provides us the ability to do UI widgets using components. It provides us data formatting or transformation types of services through the use of pipes. It gives us the ability to manipulate the DOM through directives. Now, we don't actually directly manipulate the DOM in Angular 2. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But ultimately, in a web browser, the UI has to use the DOM, and Angular 2 takes care of all of those DOM operations for us. It provides things like an HTTP module for allowing us to actually interact with REST services. We don't have to write a bunch of code directly interacting with the XHR object or some other library like jQuery. And then these services have all types of other capabilities that allow us to be able to mock the backend for doing testing and that kind of thing. Also, in terms of working with things like HTML forms or setting up routing in your application, Angular also provides solutions to all of these problems. And that's one of the great things about Angular. It's really the complete framework that solves all the problems that you would typically run into in building a web application. As opposed to something like a React, which React is awesome. I love React. But React only solves one problem. How do you display a UI widget? If you were going to use React, you'd have to incorporate a bunch of other libraries. And of course, that's fine if that's what you want to do. But for a lot of folks, they just want to get their web application up and running, and Angular 2 makes that a lot easier. One of the coolest parts of working with Angular 2 is what's known as component-driven development. It's the idea of all of your UI widgets basically being a component. Now, the term component is a little bit loaded. Depending upon the framework or library you're using, the term component can mean slightly different things. But basically the idea behind a component is that instead of building a big, huge, monolithic template that has everything jammed into it, instead you take that template and divide it out into smaller pieces. And these smaller pieces we would call components, and then you reuse those smaller pieces to build larger UIs. So instead of everything being monolithic, everything is much more compartmentalized and broken down. And that's a big part of doing Angular 2 development. And the whole component-driven thing is really not even just an Angular 2 thing. It's the whole concept behind doing React programming. Even in Angular 1.5, they added a component API so you can actually build your Angular 1.5 applications with components. There's even something out there called web components, which is really a combination of different standards to allow you to create these reusable components that can be used across many applications. So this whole idea of component-driven development is really going to be the future of building web applications and really any kind of UI for the foreseeable future. And the cool thing is Angular 2 makes all that happen for you. Now, I want to briefly mention the web components part of this. This is actually kind of one of the things that sets Angular 2 apart from something like a React. While Angular 2 and React both have components, React's a solution or approach to solving the component problem is unique to React. React has its own way of solving this problem. It doesn't attempt to follow any type of web component standard. It wasn't created for that purpose. Okay, the purpose of React is how do we quickly and efficiently update the DOM with a new set of data being applied to some type of UI logic. With Angular 2, though, with their components, what they decided to do was take the approach of actually going down the web components path. Now, there's actually 4 different specifications which comprise web components. We're not going to talk about the details of any of them, but you will see elements of 3 of them show up in your Angular 2 application. The use of custom elements, which we'll actually be making use of today. The use of templates with structural directives. You won't see that directly in our demonstration, but behind the scenes, you could actually make use of that if you wanted to. And then the shadow DOM. Now, we're not going to be talking about the shadow DOM either, but those 3 things are all part of Angular 2 components. Now, the HTML imports part of it, that's not really needed because of the way the Angular 2 applications are built. But nevertheless, the actual part that defines what a component is, that's how Angular 2 components are actually created. And so that's one of the big reasons I like using Angular 2, is because it is following those standards. As we mentioned a few moments ago, it's cross-platform. Web browsers, you can use it with the Electron framework. You can do native iOS and Android applications. You can even do universal web apps with the server rendering part of it. So what about React? The 2 big topics that I teach pretty much almost every week of the year at this point is Angular 2 and React. I love React. I think React is a great library. It's awesome. You can do some really, really cool stuff with it. However, React is only one piece of the puzzle. Angular 2 has all the puzzle pieces put together. So if you're watching this webinar and maybe you're an experienced React developer and you're thinking to yourself, well, should I use Angular 2? Should I use React? Which direction should I go? What I'd like to do is offer you this little piece of advice. If your development team wants to pick and choose every single part of the framework of your application, you want to be able to pick and choose every single library, how you want the change detection and all that other stuff to work, then you want to stick with React, because Angular 2 is a framework, it is opinionated, it's going to tell you basically how to structure your whole application. If, however, you're not into picking all of those parts, it doesn't matter to you, you just want to get up and running, building a web application today, Angular 2 is a wonderful solution for you. Now, a lot of folks that I know, a lot of companies I've done training for, one of the big reasons that they choose React is actually React Native, because they basically want to start building applications today that will not only work in a web browser, but will also be totally cross-platform to other things like iOS or Android. In that case, based upon my usage of both and based upon the anecdotal experience that I have working with customers, React Native would still be the better way to go if you wanted to build native applications. The Angular 2 stuff is awesome and the native script stuff is really cool, but the React Native stuff is much more mature. And so if you really wanted to push out something tomorrow, I would probably still recommend React Native. So with all that said, what I'd like to do is we're going to jump into some code here in a moment. And I'd like to take a quick little poll of everybody in the webinar. I want to find out if people have used React. So how many folks do I actually have in the webinar who have actually used React before and you're looking at possibly switching to Angular 2? All right, we'll give folks another couple minutes to, or another few seconds actually, to click on their answer. All right, so we have about 7% of the attendees have used React and 93% have not. Okay, awesome. I've got one more little poll I want to do here for you real quick before we continue on. How many folks here have used Angular 1? So how many folks do we have in the audience who have used Angular 1, now you're looking at going to Angular 2? All right, so it looks like we have about 65% haven't used it and about 35% have. So let me offer you this one little comment on the whole Angular 1 to Angular 2 thing, as well as the actual Angular versioning thing that's getting ready to happen here. If you have built an application in Angular 1 and you are looking at upgrading it to Angular 2, there is technically an upgrade path that you can go through. However, I have been finding that most of my training clients, most of my training customers, have been opting not to do the upgrade. Instead, they're either opting to continue to support the Angular 1 application as like a legacy app, or they're looking at rewriting parts of it in Angular 2. So here's the thing. Angular 1 and Angular 2 are very different from each other. And they're not just different in the sense of an API call. They're different in the sense of the actual concepts that you would follow to build it. In an Angular 1.4 and earlier app, the focus is really just on building templates that are kind of loosely associated with something called a controller, and that's really about it. But in Angular 1.5 and later, and in Angular 2, the whole component concept is really the central theme. And when you start building things with components, the way you would build your application becomes very different. So trying to upgrade from Angular 1 to Angular 2 is almost a completely different way of like looking at the world. And so what I have been finding most people are doing is they're actually just going back and creating a new application with Angular 2. And I know that sounds a little bit frustrating if you've already invested a lot of time and money in Angular 1, but remember, you don't have to upgrade from Angular 1. Angular 1 is an awesome framework, all right? And you can keep on using it, and you can use it for your legacy apps. But when you cross over into the world of Angular 2, you're really crossing into a whole new way of looking at things. And so it's better to make use of that new way of looking at things than it is to try to cram, you know, a square peg into a round hole. Now, in terms of the versioning thing that's getting ready to happen with Angular, as many of you probably know, in a couple of weeks, Angular 4 is going to be coming out. There's a reason they skipped from Angular 2 to 4. We're not going to go into that reason, but I do want to talk about the fact that we're now going to the next major version. The Angular team has decided that they're going to follow more of the SemVer model for doing versioning. And what that means is they're going to be basically upgrading the major version of Angular from 2 to 4 and from 4 to 5 and 5 to 6, so on and so forth, about every 6 months. But that does not mean it's a complete and total major rewrite. Going from Angular 1 to Angular 2 was a major rewrite because Angular 1, if memory is correct, was created back in 2009. So Angular 1 is very old. The way that people built web applications in 2009 is radically different than how we build web applications today in 2017. And so what they did was they went out and grabbed all the latest and greatest and coolest ways and best practices for building web applications and produced what is now known as Angular 2. And so that's why it's so radically different. But as they're moving forward and adding new features and then releasing new major versions, these new major versions are not massive rewrites like it was going from Angular 1 to Angular 2. And in fact, they're even going to be dropping the number in terms of describing what you're working on. And when you say you build Angular apps, you're just going to be saying you build Angular apps. That could be version 2, that could be version 4, could be version 5, what have you. So, so as we're moving forward, as you're looking at the content we're covering today or content you may take in a future class, just keep in mind that going from Angular 2 to Angular 4 is nothing like going from Angular 1 to Angular 2. And so it'll definitely be something you can manage as a part of your project upgrades. Now, for our environment here, we're going to be writing some code to explore some of the features of Angular 2. I'm going to be using, actually I meant to type Visual Studio Code. We're going to be using Visual Studio Code as our editor, not regular Visual Studio. And I'll be using Webpack to actually run our transpilers and bundle our code. I'm going to be using the Webpack development server to actually serve up our web pages. And then I'll be using something called the JSON server to actually serve up our REST service data behind the scenes if we end up making use of any. So let's go ahead and jump into this. As we're going through this, by the way, the actual code that I'm going to be pushing up to the GitHub site is this GitHub address right here. And I'll post this in the chat session towards the end of the session. You can also welcome to email me at eric@trainingfordevelopers.com as we're going through this if you have any questions. Okay, so let's go ahead now and let's jump into some code. So right now I have a little hello world page being displayed here up on my screen. So we have our little web browser. It's running on port 5000. And then over here I've got a bunch of code, and we're going to start doing some coding and building a simple little application. So in our project setup, I have a TS folder over here. We'll zoom in a little bit on that. There we go. I have a TS folder over here, and inside of it I have an app folder, and then I've got 3 files, main.ts, polyfills.ts, and vendor.ts. We're going to be doing all of our coding inside of this app folder here, and we're going to start off with our app module and our app component, which I'll talk about in a moment. What I want to talk about first are these 3 files right here, main.ts, polyfills, and vendor. Angular 2 is a massive framework. It does a ton of stuff, and it uses a lot of advanced features. What that means is that some of these features are not readily supported by older web browsers, or the features aren't even implemented in web browsers at all yet. So Angular 2 comes with a polyfills file that is going to have all of the polyfills necessary to get an Angular 2 app, or to get a web browser up to speed to work with your Angular 2 application. So when you see the polyfills file there, that's just a bunch of different polyfills that are being used to make your web browser work with Angular 2. This next file we have here, vendor, the vendor file has all of the third-party libraries that we're going to be using for our Angular 2 application, including Angular 2 itself. Okay? So this vendor file here is going to have a reference to all of those different parts and pieces we're going to make use of. Finally, we have our main.ts file. And this is actually going to be the main starting point here for our application. And this is actually ultimately, when it's all said and done, is going to be bundled together with all of our application files to actually be pushed out onto a web server, what have you, to actually serve up the actual application. And down here at the bottom, you can kind of see on line 18, we have our bootstrapping function for actually bootstrapping our app module, which we're going to talk about now. Now, Angular 2 has a module system in it that allows us to take the various parts of our application and kind of put them together. At the starting point of every Angular 2 application is what people typically call the app module or an application module. This module is basically going to pull in our environment, which in this case is going to be the web browser. It's also going to pull in our starting component, which we're going to call app component. Now this browser module is really important to understand like what it's doing for us. Angular 2 has been coded in such a way that it's not limited to only working in web browsers. Like I said earlier, you could tie it together and with native script and do like an iOS application or an Android application. Because of that, the actual web browser part, the actual adapter layer for talking to the web browser, is really separate from the rest of Angular 2. So if you're going to use Angular 2 in a web browser, you actually have to import the browser module so that when Angular 2 goes about rendering components and things like that, it actually knows what API to use and what adapter to use to actually make all of that happen inside of the web browser. And so, so the browser module is actually a separate thing. That's new. In Angular 1 was limited to working with a web browser, working with a DOM structure. You couldn't pull it out and try to run it in some kind of other environment. The actual web browser was very much hard-coded to the actual framework itself. And that's not to be unexpected. That's how things were back in 2009. But in today's world, when we're learning these JavaScript frameworks to be used across all platforms, separating that browser part out is really important. So this is going to be our little module that we're going to use to fire up our application. The next thing I want to take a look at here is our app component. And our app component is going to show us our little hello world page that we had over here. So if we come back over to the browser, you'll remember we had hello world. This app component is where that hello world is coded up, and it's where we're going to start doing our coding for our little application. Okay? If you take a look at our app component, you're going to see that there's this import component command here at the top. This is going to be pulling in the component decorator. Now, component or decorators in general are not a JavaScript feature. It's going to be a feature that we're going to be using as part of TypeScript. The way that Angular 2 works is that instead of creating classes like a component class or a service class by extending some type of parent component class or parent service class, for example, in React, React extends React.component. Instead of using inheritance to define the purpose of a class, we're going to be using this thing called a decorator. The decorator is really an example of the composition pattern or a mix-in. We're basically going to use the decorator to decorate this class with metadata, which is going to indicate what the role of this class is in our application. In this case, the role of this class is it's going to be a component. And we know that because we have @component decorating this class here. Now, sometimes when I teach classes, I'll see where students will start putting in all these spaces and stuff like that, thinking that @component is somehow a separate command apart from the class, but it's not. These two should really be put right together like that, and that way you'll know @component is decorating that particular class. Now, let's take a look at our @component declaration here. You're going to see I have two options set. I have one for selector and one for template. The selector represents the DOM element that this component is going to be applied to. So if we open up our index.html file, you'll see I have a color tool custom element. Remember our web components thing we talked about earlier? Custom elements are a part of that, and custom elements are a part of Angular 2. According to the HTML5 specification, you can have custom elements. But all custom elements must have a dash in their name. So all custom elements are basically two-word names if you want to think of it like that. So if you come back over here to our app component TS, you can see that we're using a selector here to select color-tool. This selector right here uses the CSS selector engine. So you can tell I'm doing an element selector by simply just having the name of the tag itself, and that's serving as my selector. So when my application bootstraps itself, it's going to be applying this component to the color tool element right here. Now, we also have a template. You'll notice that for my template, I'm using these backtick string delimiters. These are known as template literals, and they're actually an ES 2015 feature. And one of the cool things about them is that you can do multi-line strings. So for example, if I wanted to put my template in here like this, I could actually code it directly into my component. Now, depending upon the size of your application and depending upon how you want to structure your files, you may choose to include this template inside the component, or you may choose to add it as a separate file out here. For right now, we're going to keep our template in the component for the purposes of our demo. While we only have a few lines of code, it's easier to look at one file than it is to be switching between different files. But our template here is going to be defined. Now you'll notice, for those of you with Angular 1 experience, you'll notice that here with our little header template variable, we're still using the double curly braces. So when you work with Angular 2, there will be some parts of the syntax which will feel familiar to you, such as this template variable or template expression that you see right here. Okay, so now let's come down here to our actual class itself. All right. One of the cool things with Angular 2 is you do use ES 2015 classes. You want to be really careful if you're coming from a Java or C# background. You really don't want to think of ES 2015 classes as Java classes or C#. They're actually radically different, and if you're not familiar with the differences, I would encourage you to go learn about that. We're not going to talk about it now, but go learn about it. It'd be well worth your time. On our class, we're going to have a property declaration statement. This property declaration statement is not actually valid JavaScript either. It's part of TypeScript. But what it's going to allow us to do is to easily define a property on our component instance and then assign a value to it. So basically, when this component gets instantiated, it's going to have a header property on it. The header property will be of type string, and we're going to assign the value hello world to that header property. Then when Angular brings our page to life, it's going to take this hello world value and actually populate the template with it here where it says header. Okay? So if you come back over, that's why we see hello world. Now, what we're going to build is we're going to build ourselves a very simple little color tool application. Nothing complex, but we're going to be able to explore some of the basic features of working with Angular 2. And as we go along, I'll try to point out some similarities with Angular 1. So, our color tool here needs a new header value. We actually need to give this thing a name. So instead of calling it hello world, we're going to come in here and we're going to change it to color tool. And we're going to save it. Now you'll notice when I save it, I have all of my Webpack stuff down here actually processing this. If you're interested in learning more about Webpack, there's lots of resources out there, lots of Angular 2 starter projects. You're also welcome to visit my Angular 2 starter project. You can kind of see my configuration. I'm using Webpack 2, and I'm using the Webpack dev server to serve up our web pages. And if we actually go back over to our web browser here, you'll see that it automatically refreshed itself. And that's actually a feature of the Webpack dev server, version 2 of it at least. But a feature of the Webpack dev server is you can do the live reloading here. Okay? Now, let's switch back over here and let's go ahead and start to build out our application a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to build ourselves a list of colors. So if we're going to build a list of colors, let's go ahead and add some stuff to the template first to make that happen. We're going to add an unordered list item. And we're going to close that off. We're then going to come into here. We're going to put in a list item. We're then going to say asterisk ng4 equal to let color of colors. Then we're going to say color, and we're going to close this off. Now, you'll notice that we have these little commands and stuff inside of our template, this ng4 right here. This is what's known as a directive. And because there's a little asterisk in front of it, it's what's known as a structural directive. A structural directive in Angular is going to be doing the adding and removing of DOM elements is really the best way to think about it. So what's going to happen here is we're going to build ourselves a list of colors, and for each color in the list, ng4 is going to create another list item like you see here. Okay? Now, ng4 in Angular 1 was called ngRepeat. Okay? So they're very similar in terms of how they work. The idea is based upon a set of data, duplicating a DOM element over and over and over and over again. So the question now is, how do we populate our data here for colors? So if we come into here, we're going to say public colors string, and we're going to make it an array, and then we're going to create an array of colors here. So let's do some colors. We'll do red, white, green, blue, and yellow. All right. Now, you'll notice I'm putting a comma here at the end of my list. This is what's known as a trailing comma. This is actually going to be part of JavaScript in ES 2017, but it's part of TypeScript now. And the idea is that if I had to come in and add another color, let's say I wanted to add another color black, I shouldn't have to come up here and modify this line in order to add a new line here. For those of you who do a lot of really close tracking of your source control systems and counting the number of lines that have changed, not changing 2 lines when you only were intending to add 1 is a good thing. So they have this trailing comma now where you can put that comma. So there's our trailing comma. We'll save our page. We'll come back over to our web browser, and you'll see we'll have our list. Red, white, green, blue, yellow, and black. If we actually come in here and inspect the DOM structure for this, you're going to see where the ng4 duplicated the list item for each item in the list. Okay? So we didn't have to write a bunch of jQuery code or other DOM manipulation code to make this happen. It just simply duplicated the item over and over and over again. All right? Now that we have a list of items, we might actually want to be able to add a new color to the list. So let's do that. To add a new color to the list, I'm going to add a form. So here's my form. And with our form, we're going to add ourselves a label and an input. So I'll do a div here. And we'll have a label. So we'll say label, new color. We'll add an input field, input type equal to text. And we'll do ID, new color, input. And let's clap our side thing there. So ID new color input. I'm going to take this new color input, and I'm going to come right up here to label, and I'm going to say 4, just like that. Then I'm going to come into here and give this thing a name. So we'll say new color input. And then we're going to use something called ngModel to do two-way data binding. So those of you with Angular 1 experience, you probably remember ngModel. ngModel is the directive that you use to do two-way data binding. ngModel is available in Angular 2. So we're going to do something here called banana brackets. And we're going to say ngModel. Actually, we're going to do ngModel. And then we're going to say new color. There we go. So there's our little input field. Now, in order to use ngModel, we're going to have to bring in something called the Forms module. Unlike Angular 1, where everything was kind of like included and built into the whole framework, in Angular 2, like I said before, that kind of divided things out. So now if we want to make use of ngModel and make use of forms, we're going to have to come back over to our app module and actually say import forms module from @Angular forms. And then we're going to have to register our forms module with our actual module imports down here. There we go. And now let's head back over to app component TS. So now our ngModel should work for us. But in order to actually add the color, we really need to put a little button here to trigger that, hey, we're done typing in, let's go ahead and add the color. So we're going to say button and type equal to button. And we're going to register a click event handler here. All right, and then we're going to say add color. There we go. And then we'll just put a little label here on our button for add color. Okay, so we've completed the first part here of actually putting together a little bit of a template. All right, so as you can see, all of this looks like standard regular HTML code. except for the little ng model thing here and the click, everything looks pretty normal to us. So that's one nice thing about Angular 2 is if you really like working with a template-based system, it works awesome. So let's come down here and finish wiring this thing up. The first thing we need to do is actually take our new color, and we're going to come down here and we're going to set up our new color on here. Say public new color string, and we're going to give it a default value of just an empty string. Okay? Now, we need to wire up our click event handler here for our actual add color functionality. So we'll come into here and say public add color, and then we're going to take the new color that was typed in, this property here, and actually add it to the list of colors. So we'll say this.colors.push, just like that, okay? And we're going to push on the new color. So we'll say this.new color. And this will actually add the new color to our list, and then the color should appear in our list when we actually click the button. So let's go ahead. We have our list here. Let's add in a new color. We'll say orange. And then we'll click add color, and you can see orange has now been added to the list. All right? There we go. Now, the question is, how did Angular know to take this color, push it onto the list, and then automatically update this thing right here? Okay? How does that whole mechanism work? This is the concept of change detection. The idea of knowing when something has changed and then updating the UI to reflect that change. So it's really a combination of knowing something did change, what actually changed, and then making those updates. In Angular 1, if you ever use that, you're familiar with something called the digest loop. And basically in Angular 1, you had to use things like ng-click and stuff like that. And what that would do is run your click function, and then after it ran it, it would then run the digest loop in response to that change, and then update the UI with your changes. Angular 2 also has a change detection mechanism, but it's a lot different, and it's a lot more revolutionary and a lot cooler. It uses something called zones. If you think about it in a web browser, any type of UI change that would occur would always be the result of an asynchronous operation, such as clicking a button, getting a result from an AJAX call, receiving new data over WebSockets. And literally what Zone.js does is Zone.js wraps all of the asynchronous operations or all the asynchronous APIs and functions inside of your web browser so that no matter what triggers the asynchronous operation, when it actually executes, the zone system picks up on it. And then that zone system is hooked into Angular 2 and then notifies Angular 2 when the zone has completed. And then Angular 2 does its whole change detection mechanism and updating the UI. The reason why this is so cool and revolutionary is that in Angular 1, when you had to do things like $apply and $digest whenever incorporating third-party components and things like that, you don't have to do any of that in Angular 2. Because in Angular 2, the zone system has actually taken over the browser, and then Angular 2 feeds off the results of that zone system. And it's actually really, really cool. And it's one of the big reasons, I think, for using Angular 2, because it really makes the entire process of integrating new things into it very seamless because of that whole zone system. But at this point, we now have the ability to add a color. We have a list of colors, all right? And so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to ask a couple of questions and get some responses, and then we'll talk about one last thing before we wrap everything up. The first question I'd like to ask everybody is, what exactly is the purpose of a component? So we've been working with this component. It has done some things for us. Based upon what I've shown you, what do you think the purpose of a component is? All right, so we've got some votes coming in here. Okay, so the purpose of a component is a component is a type of directive. It's a type of directive that actually has a template. So for those of you in the 25% here, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and we'll share the results. The purpose of the component is to actually apply data to the template to display the UI. That's the actual purpose of a component. To organize the parts of an Angular application, a good answer for that would be a module. So the module is where you pull together all the different parts and then be able to reuse that collection of parts across multiple applications, that kind of thing. But the purpose of the component is to actually display the UI stuff. All right, so let's ask another question here. Does Angular 2 use inheritance to determine the purpose of a class? All right, we'll give folks another couple seconds here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's share the results. Okay, Angular 2 does not use inheritance. So those who answered no, you got it right. Good job. Angular 2 uses decorators, which is really a form of composition or an example of the mix-in pattern for basically mixing in metadata into your class, which then identifies what it is to Angular 2 and what role and purpose it's trying to serve in that. Okay? All right, so what I want to do now is I want to do a quick example of something called composition. In Angular 1, when people would build their templates with their loosely associated controllers, they would build big, huge monolithic templates that had all of their functionality baked into that one template. While Angular provided ways of not doing that and organizing it better, a lot of developers really didn't utilize it because those other ways were very complicated to use. So in Angular 2, with components, though, it makes it a lot easier to do these kinds of things. And so that's what I'd like us to work on next. We're going to actually move part of our application out to its own separate component and then pass data into it. So coming back over here to our color tool, we're going to take our color list, and we're actually going to move the color list out of this main template into its own child component. And then we're going to pass the color list into that child component. So I'm going to come over here to our actual File Explorer, and underneath the app folder, I'm going to create a new folder here called Components. Inside of Components, I'm going to create a new file called itemlist.component.ts. Itemlist.component.ts is going to be holding our list of items. And so we're going to come into here, we're going to import our component decorator. And then we're going to go ahead and decorate this thing. So we'll say component selector item-list. For our template, we'll just come over here to our first component, and I'm just going to copy the template out of here and paste it right into here. So we'll clean it up here a little bit. Okay. Now, for our list item here, we don't want to say color of colors, because what we're going to do here is build a general purpose item list that can be reused over and over and over again. That's one of the most essential parts of actually working with Angular 2, is when you build out these components and you create child components, what you want to do is set it up so that you can reuse these things. If everything you're building is a one-time use thing, then you're missing out on one of the best advantages of using a component-based system like Angular 2. So we're going to say let item of items, and then we're simply just going to say item. And so now we have our list. So now let's go ahead and set this thing up so that we can pass some data into it. In order to pass data into it, we're going to need something called the input decorator. This is going to allow us to establish a parameter, if you want to think of it like that, for our component. So we'll say export class item list, And then we're going to set up our input. So we'll have input. And then we're going to have items. And we'll make it an array of strings. And we can initialize it with an empty string. There we go. All right. So we have our at component. Can't forget to put our public on there like that. And so we have at input with our public item string. Now, in order to use this item list, I'm going to have to register it with my module. This is one of these things that people forget to do all the time when building their Angular 2 apps. So they'll create all these components, but then forget to register it with the module. So we'll come over to our module, and we'll go ahead and import it. We'll say import item list from components / item list component. And then we're going to take item list and register it with the declaration section of our module. So there's item list right there. Okay. Now, jumping back over to app component, we can actually now make use of this. Now, what's cool is we don't actually have to import item list in here. Because item list has already been registered with the module, we can make use of it in our template without actually having to explicitly pull the component into our page. So we're going to replace all of this code here with item list. And we're going to have items, and we're going to say colors. Now, in order for this input to work, we're going to have to decorate our attribute. In Angular 2, you indicate the behavior of the attribute by the little symbols you put here. So for example, we have square brackets, or down here we have parentheses, or here we have square and parentheses called banana brackets. Okay? Think of it as a banana in a box. Unlike Angular 1, where you had to define the role of the attribute inside of the directive configuration itself, in Angular 2, you indicate how you want to interact with this property, specifically here in terms of actually using it in terms of placing item list in our actual template. So what this will do is, because we have the brackets, it's actually going to evaluate colors as an actual property on the component and then pass in the array of strings. And then those array of strings will be passed into item list and then be made available on the items property inside of the component. So we'll come over to here, we'll save this. We'll come back over to our web browser, and you can see our list is now showing up. Now what's cool is if we come into Color Tool, you'll see that we have an actual item list custom element, and then underneath of it we have the actual content of the unordered list and then our list of items here. So I'll come into here and I'll say orange once again, add color, so on and so forth. Okay? And this is what's known as decomposing a larger component into smaller components and then recomposing them back together through the reference of the individual components being used here. The ability to master this component composition and do the component-driven development, in my opinion, is the fundamental most important part of being an Angular 2 developer, writing Angular 2 applications, and I would even say the same thing is true of React application developers, Angular 1.5 application developers. The ability to work with these components, that's really the big game changer over older frameworks, doing things like with Backbone and Handlebars, or even Angular 1.4 and earlier, that kind of thing. So this right here is an example of a very simple Angular 2 application. There's a whole lot of stuff going on here behind the scenes in terms of the project configuration to make everything come to life. If you're interested in seeing more about that, you can actually come over to the GitHub site, and I'll take the link right here, and I'm going to post it up onto a empty file so everybody can see the link. So you can go here if you'd like, and you can actually see the actual source code for this. I'll push up the demonstration once the webinar is over, and I'm also going to put this inside of the chat window right here. So everybody who's in the class, if you want to click on that link, you can check out my project setup. I borrowed some project setup ideas from a few other projects which I have documented in the README file, so you might want to check out their websites as well. Okay, so before we switch over to questions, I got a couple of poll questions left to ask you guys. Let's do a quick poll. So we'll start with this. Should the whole UI be coded in one component? Or should you use component composition? All right, awesome. Everybody answered no, 100% on that one. That's great, yeah. You definitely don't want to be coding the whole UI in one component. All right, so great job. Everybody passed. So now, let's also ask one last one here. So the square brackets, did we use the square brackets for inputs or did we use it for outputs? And before you answer the question, think of how we did the click event and think of the click event as an output. All right, so if you remember, we had square brackets around items, but parentheses around the click. That's right, it's used for inputs. Excellent job, everybody. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, Angular 2 is really powerful. It's really awesome. Before we get to questions, I do want to mention to everybody, we do actually have a course coming up. It's going to, let's see here. It's going to be on March 8th and 9th. It's a 2-day class. And we're going to be going over this stuff and a whole lot more. And the whole entire class is all live coding. We're going to be building applications. You'll be working on cool exercises. And you'll really get a chance to actually do real Angular 2 coding, not just watch a slide presentation. So it's a lot of fun. It's very interactive. And so if you'd be interested in that class, check out Wintelec's webpage here, and you can register for the class. So with all that said, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Technically, the webinar ends in 8 minutes, but I don't have to go anywhere in 8 minutes. So I can hang around for a little extra longer to take as many questions as people have. If you happen to ask a question that for whatever reason I don't know the answer to, I'll private message you back, and then we can have a follow-up discussion via email afterwards. But if anybody has any questions, go ahead and go to the chat window now, or the questions window, and go ahead and ask some questions. And let me go through the list here. We've got a couple. Use React. All right, let's see. Thank you for everybody for letting me know you still see the poll screen. That's the #1 question. Should the poll screen still should that still be up on the window? All right. So let's see here. All right, so I gave you guys the link to GitHub. That's awesome. All right, cool. All right, why TypeScript? This is a great question. So one of the attendees had the question of why TypeScript. So here's the deal. I love JavaScript. I admit it. I love JavaScript. I love the loose typing nature of JavaScript. And if I'm completely honest with you, I was probably one of the last holdouts for wanting to go to TypeScript. I just love JavaScript for what it is, and the thought of having TypeScript and doing all of this strong typing, I was like, you know, that takes away like one of the best features that I love about JavaScript. But here's the truth. When you work on large enterprise scale projects, and you're working on one small piece, and you're not familiar with all the APIs, all the object structures, you're just one person on a large team, having strong typing makes your life a lot easier. You get better IntelliSense, you have a better understanding of the shapes of objects, you have a better understanding of what function inputs are expected, or function arguments and parameters. It just makes everything a lot easier. So the big reason for using TypeScript is because the strong typing makes a lot of sense when building enterprise projects. Now, that being said, TypeScript supports something called the AnyType. So in situations where you like using the loose typing, or you want to be able to change the shapes of your objects easily, then the AnyData type is perfect. And so once I really learned TypeScript, and once I understood that I could use strong typing where I wanted it, and then not use it where I didn't want it, then I became a huge fan of TypeScript. And honestly, if I'm building any application for the most part, even React applications, I use TypeScript. Now, when we talk about TypeScript, we really have two different feature sets. We have the actual strong typing itself, And then we have the actual ES 2015 stuff that people use TypeScript to do the transpilation for. The ES 2015 stuff is now largely supported by the web browser. So you don't really need TypeScript if you want to use classes or you want to use the spread operator, stuff like that. Web browsers, at least modern ones, actually support those features. But we do want to use TypeScript to support more advanced, newer features that aren't even supported by JavaScript yet, such as things like decorators. Now, ultimately, a decorator gets transpiled to JavaScript, and behind the scenes, it does put additional metadata on that class. But writing all of that JavaScript code yourself to do that is a real pain, and it doesn't help your productivity at all. Whereas if you use the decorators provided by TypeScript, it makes your life so much easier. So I think what you'll find is once you start using TypeScript, you'll actually really grow to love it, especially for larger apps. Now, if you're like a one-person team working on one project and you know all the different parts and pieces that it does, TypeScript and the strong typing might be a little bit of overkill for you, but still, I would still recommend using it anyways. I will tell you this, out of all the Angular 2 classes that I've taught now, and I've been teaching them since June of last year, back with release candidate, it was either 2 or 4 or something like that, none of my clients, none of them have opted to go the JavaScript route. All of them have opted to go the TypeScript route. So I would definitely say if you're doing Angular 2 development, you're choosing to go with TypeScript, okay? All right. Will the course use a database, and if so, which? We won't actually be using a database in the class. Connecting to the database and all of that stuff is not really client-side coding. That's more server-side coding. We'll be using something called the JSON server. And the JSON server will be serving up data to us through REST services, and then we'll be interacting with that through the HTTP service with our application. When we do the Angular 2 stuff, we're really focused in on doing the programming in the web browser itself. All right, is there so a person had a question, any reason why new applications should be done in 1 versus 2? No, I would not recommend writing any new applications in Angular 1 whatsoever. Angular 1 was awesome. It's great. But Angular 2 is 1,000 times better. There's no need to go back to that old style technology. Whatever it is you choose to do, it's either going to be Angular 2, React, or some other similar framework or library that works in the more modern way. You don't want to go back to anything that locks you into a DOM. So you don't want to go back to things like doing jQuery code or Angular 1 or doing a bunch of handlebar stuff with Backbone. All of those were great technologies in their time, but we've now moved past that. No, the March course is not free. You actually do have to pay for it, but the webinar is free. Okay, so what UI library do I recommend for doing really sophisticated Angular 2 UI stuff? I don't have a specific recommendation on that. There are various vendors out there that provide various levels of support for Angular 2. There are other libraries out there like Material Design that provide some stuff for Angular 2, building Angular 2 components. Because Angular 2 is so new, I think it'll be a little while before you see a major dominant vendor that is producing a UI library that everybody wants to use. I will tell you this, though. Unless you're doing some really cool, complex stuff, like maybe you have a data grid and you want to do some really amazing stuff with it, for the most part, I would code your own stuff. I don't mean reinvent the wheel. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that your default approach should not be drop a big, huge UI library in on top of your Angular 2 app. You should try to build your application and actually build stuff using the Angular 2 framework, and you're going to find that a lot of the things you may have always gone and used a third-party library for, you may not need to. You might just be able to code it yourself, using the regular, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the Angular 2 framework. That would be my first approach. And then if I encountered some type of control where I really needed a bunch of extra special functionality that would be a real waste of time to reinvent the wheel on, then I would go look for that third-party library. But I wouldn't do that as my default. I would do my best to work with what a web browser does before throwing in a lot of extra code. Because you have to realize these UI libraries are huge. It's more to download, more memory is consumed, and if you don't really need it, or if you're using something that has 500 features, but you only need one of those features, it's a real waste to have to download all that extra stuff. All right, let's see here. CSS frameworks. Okay, so CSS frameworks are basically what CSS. So Angular 2, while its component system does have support for the concept of the shadow DOM and the ability to isolate part of the DOM tree from the larger DOM tree, and the CSS doesn't bleed through, at the end of the day, Angular 2 is really a JavaScript thing. So whatever framework you want to use in terms of, let's say, Bootstrap, you just simply make use of the various stylings and selectors that you would use to make use of it. Angular 2 doesn't necessarily have to have some type of type integration with it. Now, if you actually look here at my editor, and I go over to my vendors file, you will see that I am actually loading up Bootstrap as part of my project. I'm actually importing something called the Bootstrap loader, and it's actually loading up, I believe it's Bootstrap version 4 alpha 6. And I'm using Bootstrap, or I could use Bootstrap with my application if I wanted to. But this importing of the Bootstrap loader really has nothing to do with Angular 2. This is just allowing me to import my Bootstrap stuff so it gets packaged together with my Webpack bundles, and then it's available for my application to use. So, so there's not really a whole lot of integration in the sense that you have to do something special to make Angular 2 work with Bootstrap. You just simply place the appropriate DOM markers on your template, and then Bootstrap will apply itself the standard way in which CSS is applied to a web page inside of a web browser. All right, can we code a complex UI in Angular 2 such that change detection for each part performs independently? I've never tried to do that. Here's the thing, is that everything in Angular 2 in terms of change detection is pretty tightly bundled. You do have a change detection option that you can specify on a component, and what that allows you to do is it only does change detection on its child components if its own input parameters have changed. It's called on push, basically, is the name of the setting. With respect to on push, you can wire up your component to be able to only update parts of the tree that you want to based upon it knowing whether or not the input's changed. It is possible to write your own change detector functions that you can then incorporate into Angular 2's change detection system. But in terms of really having a bunch of separate parts that aren't really part of that change detection system, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying in none of the classes that I've taught have we ever done that. And I think if you were going to do that, that would be a very, very advanced thing that you would be applying. And depending upon what you had to do to accomplish it, it may not even be all that desirable because you could introduce other problems into your application. One of the things we want to be careful about is doing too many wild and crazy things that prevent the general flow, the general pattern of how things work. Because what happens in the long run is we think we've done some type of cool optimization, made it a little bit better, but then down the road, we end up making the maintenance and supporting and extending of all of that code very hard to do. And so I have found that most of the time when I try to go super crazy awesome with some type of really advanced thing, I end up regretting it down the road because it's much harder to support and maintain, and it really didn't add that much value to what I was trying to accomplish anyways. Yeah, I don't have a quick example of native script to show you, so I apologize for that. Okay, so next question was, does Angular have a database adapter? So I think once again, this kind of deals with one of the underlying maybe misconceptions of what Angular is and what JavaScript or TypeScript client-side frameworks really are. So When you do Java or C# programming, doing things like ASP.NET MVC, Spring MVC, or web forms or whatever, you do all of your UI programming as well as your database logic and stuff like that pretty much all on the server side. So you have server-side templates, you've got code that gets data from the database and populates the templates. The HTML is all built on the server and then pushed down to the client. In those types of frameworks, talking about database adapters or ways of accessing data in terms of the framework providing something makes a whole lot of sense. However, in Angular 2, that's not really the case. In Angular 2, it focuses on the UI. There really is no talking directly to databases, especially in the context of a web browser. The web browser can make requests to some external service through HTTP, and Angular provides an HTTP client to do that. But beyond making HTTP requests, there's nothing specific in Angular that would have like a database driver to talk to SQL Server or something like that. All of that would be handled on your server-side code and then exposed through maybe a REST service or a GraphQL service or something cool like that. All right. So, do you have to know TypeScript in order to take the intro class? No, you do not. In the class, we'll cover TypeScript as we are using it and needing it. You do not need to know TypeScript to take the class at all. If you had some basic understanding of JavaScript, HTML, CSS, how a web browser works, what a web application is, how to type in a text editor, that kind of stuff, that's what you need for the class. The class does not assume knowledge of TypeScript. It does not assume knowledge of Angular 2 at all. It assumes that this is like a total, a fresh start for you. You're starting from the very beginning. Okay, will Angular 4 be a big departure? Not according to the Angular team. Okay, Angular 4 will not be a big departure from Angular 2. Most of it is all focused around better debugging capabilities, performance enhancements, that kind of thing. In the class, if there are any changes that will impact anything, we will talk about that in the class in terms of working through our Angular content. In fact, the class is titled Introduction to Angular 2, but depending upon the release date of Angular 4, it might actually be better just to term the class Introduction to Angular, because we'll be using whatever is the latest thing that comes out right when the class starts. All right, so if you're not writing for mobile, would you choose Angular 2 or React? I get this question a lot. I'll be honest with you, I would choose Angular 2 without hesitation. I love React. I teach a lot of React classes. I love React. I love GraphQL. I love Relay. I love Redux. I love all the little libraries that go along with React. I think React is a great library, and I think combining it with other libraries turns it into a great framework. However, if at the end of the day I have to make a choice, I would choose to go with Angular 2. The thing that I really love about Angular 2 is the whole web components part of it. I also like the fact of the whole Zone.js and the way change detection works. I think it's really awesome. I like how everything is all built around observables. While all of those things I just described you can do with React, at the end of the day, it's all built and ready to go for me to use with Angular 2. And so I think in terms of a total complete framework getting up and running, I think one of the things we have to remember, right, is that the goal of our software development, for most of us at least, is to solve business problems and produce an actual application that somebody can use to solve whatever problem it is they need solved. We don't work with technology for the sake of technology. We work with technology to solve a problem. So if I have to make a choice between something that's going to take me a little bit longer to get set up and running, I have to do more boilerplate coding, I have to do more coding to integrate all the pieces together, or something that does all the cool stuff and it's up and running to get started with, then I'm going to choose to go with the thing that's up and running and ready to get started with. One of the things, for example, take Backbone. Backbone was an awesome library. But one of the problems with Backbone was that you had to write all of this boilerplate code to accomplish anything. To pull in all these other libraries to make an actual framework was just a lot of work. The same thing is kind of true of React. You have to do a fair amount of work to pull together all these libraries and make them talk to each other. In fact, when I teach a React class, we cover the same amount of content that we'd cover in a half-day Angular 2 class. It takes us a full day to do that in React, because React just requires more effort to accomplish something. Does that mean React is bad? No. There are some people who really don't like certain things about Angular 2, so they really want to go with React. And they love the way that it works, and they have the knowledge and expertise to tie it all together, and that's great. But if you're a regular Java, C# server-side developer, you're coming into the JavaScript space for the first time, I think it's personally easier to get up and running with Angular 2. And I'll tell you this, I've taught a lot of Angular 1 and I've taught a lot of Angular 2. People get up to speed on Angular 2 faster than they do Angular 1. So if you're on a team of people and they're like, oh, we're not going to use Angular 2 because they didn't like Angular 1, that's a bad reason to not choose Angular 2. It really is a radically different thing. Okay, another question of what does it take to convert Angular 1 to Angular 2? The best answer I have to that question is it basically takes whatever it takes to rewrite your application. Now, if you had 5 other people talking to you right now on the webinar, they might all disagree with me. But because I believe so strongly in the component-based approach to developing applications, I don't see any reason why I would want to take some big monolithic Angular 1.4 and earlier application and then try to convert it to work within Angular 2. I would rather start with a fresh set of files and build the application from the ground up following that entire component-driven approach. Now, if you're coming from Angular 1.5, my answer might be a little bit different. Because the way Angular 1.5 is all built around component-based development, it is probably a little easier to migrate to Angular 2. But even with that said, I would migrate it to the Angular 2 API. I would not try to use some type of update shim to try to make it work with the Angular 2 API. I think all the time that you would spend trying to fix the problems associated with that shim just simply wouldn't make it worth it. You'd be better off just using plain old regular Angular 2 to actually do those changes. By the way, I will say this, for those of you who are experts at Angular 1 and you know how to do directives and you understand controller as and you understand the component API, what's really funny is if you actually compare how Angular 2 syntax works with Angular 1.5, there's a lot of similarity. We won't cover that in the class, but I throw that out there to you. If you understand how classes work in ES 2015 and you understand how controller as works in Angular 1, you realize there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of what's actually conceptually happening in terms of storing that data and stuff on the actual component itself. It's kind of cool. All right, thoughts on Ember.js. So I don't really have a lot of thoughts on Ember.js. Years and years ago, I started trying to use Ember for a project, and I found that Ember, specifically Ember Data, was very frustrating to use, and it didn't work very well. And so at the time, I was choosing between Angular 1 and Ember, and I ultimately went with Angular 1. And so ever since then, I've never gone back and checked out Ember. I will tell you this, in the corporate training space, I haven't come across a lot of places that use Ember. I'm not saying nobody uses it, and I'm not saying it's not a great framework. I'm just saying I haven't seen a lot of places using it. So if you have to make a choice, do we go React, do we go Ember, do we go Angular 2, you need to ask yourself, if we have to go hire employees to come build this for us, then are we going to be able to find people in the marketplace who know how to build Ember apps? Or are we going to find more React developers or more Angular 2? So one of the big parts of choosing a framework is not just the technology, but also can you find people who know what it is? There's nothing worse than finding some piece of technology that 3 people in the world know how to use, build your whole application with it, and then you have to go find employees to come support it for you, but nobody knows what it is and you spend all your time training them. If you choose something like an Angular 2 or a React, you know you're going to find people who actually know how this stuff works, and you can actually hire them, and then they can actually start coming and doing work for you. Visual Studio Code extensions to support Angular 2 development. Yes, I do have some extension recommendations. If you actually go to the GitHub site and scroll down, you'll see where I have a bunch of Visual Studio Code extensions listed. I would recommend having ESLint, HTMLint, MarkdownLint, SassLint, and TSLint. My project supports some JavaScript stuff for some of the configuration files. HTML hint if you were to move your actual HTML files to an external file so you could have hinting for your templates. Markdown for any README files and things like that that you have inside your project. My project is using Sass, so if we had any CSS or SCSS we were incorporating in would all be processed by the Sass transpiler. So SassLint is awesome. And then the most important of all of them is TSLint. If you notice, when I was typing code at times, you'd see little green underlines in my TypeScript files. So for example, if I come over to vendor, and let's get rid of the semicolon, you'll see the little green squiggly. That's being put there by TSLint. I absolutely recommend TSLint for doing all of your code linting for TypeScript. It really does make life a lot easier for you. All right, let's see here. Insert that one. IDE. What IDE do I recommend? I love Visual Studio Code. I really do. I think Visual Studio Code, out of all the, we'll call them Sublime, Atom type-like editors out there, is by far the best. I used to use Atom all the time. The reason I stopped using Atom initially was because over here on the little file tree, Atom's file tree doesn't zoom in and out. So you can see the actual file tree zooms in and out. And so I teach a lot of classes, and a lot of times I want to point out something in the file tree, so it's useful that it allows me to zoom in and out on that. I have found that the TypeScript support in Visual Studio Code is great. It doesn't mean the TypeScript plugin for Atom isn't any good. It works fine. I just prefer working with Visual Studio Code. It just feels like a more solid environment to work with. And so it's my preferred IDE. It's built on the same Electron platform created by GitHub that Atom is created on. So you can run this on, Linux, Windows, Mac, what have you. So it's great for all my training classes because usually I have people with Windows or Mac and sometimes Linux. So they can all run the same editor. So that would be the IDE I would recommend. There are other IDEs you can use. You can use regular Visual Studio. You can use JetBrains IntelliJ or WebStorm. A lot of my students use VI, believe it or not, VI and Emacs. So it's really whatever you want to use. You're not limited to a particular editor. Because I'm using command line programs like Webpack to do my file processing, I haven't locked myself into a particular development environment. One of the mistakes that people will do is they'll actually configure all their automatic processing of stuff within the IDE itself. And when you do that, let's say you use the file watcher capability of WebStorm. While the file watcher capability is awesome, the moment you now rely upon that, all of the developers on your team have to use WebStorm. But if you do everything as a node-based or NPM-based development environment, people are free to use whatever editor they like. And because so many of these third-party extensions and plugins are ported to all the different editors, you can use TSLint with Atom. You can use TSLint with Visual Studio Code. You can do TSLinting inside of WebStorm, I believe. Okay? So you can use these extensions in all these editors. And so it's better to let developers, in my opinion, choose what they want to work with as opposed to forcing everybody into the same editor. All right. Yes, the final code that I wrote, I'm going to push it up to GitHub as soon as the webinar is over. All right, let's see. This thing was recorded, so I believe a link will be sent out later with the actual recording so you can go back and you can listen. I will also make the slides available as well. I'll send that off to Wintellect, and then they can distribute that as part of the class. In fact, you know what I'll do? I'll even put the slides up on GitHub so you can get them right off of GitHub. That'll make it easier. Okay, let's see here. All right, so I've got a gentleman here who is a legacy Visual Basic guy. And so he's got a really great question about should he try to play catch up with C# web development or should he start off with Angular 2? And I get this question all the time. There are lots of Java and C# developers out there in the world, but there's not enough JavaScript/TypeScript developers. Also, web development in terms of building web pages is no longer a server-side thing. It's fundamentally a client-side thing. So if anybody came to me and said, Eric, what language should I learn to get a job today doing programming, building modern applications, I would tell them to learn JavaScript/TypeScript. I would tell them to learn how to build applications inside of a web browser and how to use frameworks like Angular or React or React Native to be able to build totally cross-platform UIs. I would not, if I was starting off today, I would not go off and learn how to do server-side applications with Java or C#. It doesn't mean those are bad technologies, but the industry has now shifted. It's changed. And when you talk about a web developer, we're not talking about Java and C# people. When we talk about web developers, we're talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then any of the transpiled languages that go along with those, like TypeScript or Sass, and then all of the UI frameworks and libraries that go along with that as well. We're not talking about anything on the server. So if you are a legacy coder and you're like, I want to jumpstart my career and get into the latest and greatest stuff, bypass Java and C# server-side development and jump right into this JavaScript stuff and use things like Angular 2. That's what I would recommend. Like I said, lots of Java developers out there, lots of C# developers, but not as many JavaScript developers as we really need to be able to build these modern UIs. All right. So we have a question about the missing WPF Silverlight features for the web. Basically, the question is this. There are features in Windows Presentation Foundation and Silverlight that are missing in terms of what the web and HTML is. And so the question is, does Angular 2 address some of those issues? I'm not really a WPF or Silverlight developer, but based upon my understanding of the programming patterns that you see there, I guess in a sense, Angular 2 fills that gap. It definitely makes it easier for us to build these applications. Now, at the end of the day, you got to keep in mind that a web page is still limited by what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript do. Angular 2 can't do any piece of functionality that the web browser doesn't support. And so technically, anything the web browser supports, you could code yourself without Angular 2. Angular 2 just makes it easier to do that, okay? But in terms of WPF and SL features, I guess you could make an argument that makes your development a little bit more like that in terms of making it easier to program something similar to that for web applications. Is Angular going to bridge the gap for native apps? I believe it is. Like I said, I've done a little bit of React Native. I've done a little bit of native script with Angular 2. And I believe it is going to bridge the gap. I believe Angular 2 is truly going to become the universal framework for building all kinds of UIs on all kinds of platforms. I think it'll take a little bit of time. It's incredible the pace at which the Angular team moves for pushing out new stuff. I mean, they're pushing out new stuff all the time. But give it a little bit of time. It's going to be universally used on all of these platforms, and I think you're going to be really pleased with the results that you get from it. Okay, that actually concludes all of the questions that we have. Did anybody else have any questions before we end the webinar? Okay, before we go, my email address for anybody who would like to contact me after class is eric@trainingfordevelopers.com. I'm going to post that into the chat window. I'm always happy to hear from people if you have any questions, so don't hesitate to write me. If I can answer your question, I will. If I can't, then I'll let you know that I can't. But I want to thank everybody for tuning in for this, and we had a ton of people. And everybody pretty much hung on until the end, so I appreciate that. And I wish you guys all the best in making your decisions about your UI frameworks and libraries. And I wish you all the best in all the future applications that you code. So take care, and if anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to email me.